just like on any other day.
That's not the most insane thing I've heard about schools lately. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
anyone else reading Abigail Schreier's recent book? Yeah.
I haven't read it yet, but I've listened to some interviews. It's really interesting. And happy Eclipse Day, everybody. Can you see, Deborah?
I'm gonna
Yeah. It is Monday, April 8th, Solid Ground number 63, I believe we are. And today we have Aaron Terrell joining us. Aaron is one of the co-hosts of the Transparency podcast. And we are going to talk about whether lesbians exist. So it was a really interesting little aside. It was the interview. We talked about this last week with Nina Paley. We talked about the Jordan Peterson, Michael Schellenberger interview, which was really great. It had a lot in it to discuss. And amidst all this lovely content, there's this one little comment, just really quick aside, where Jordan Peterson says, and I don't believe lesbians exist. I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like that. And then he just goes back about his business, and we're all left, what? Will you say more about that, please? What does that mean? And so it was super interesting. And I saw a tweet that Aaron posted yesterday, and it was something along these lines, and I not exactly, but it had enough of a flavor. I'll let you get into that, Aaron. And I thought that would be fascinating to talk about with you. So before we launch into that, Deborah, do you want to do the Solid Ground blurb? Tell everybody who we are.
Sure. My real eyes. So Solid Ground is a peer support community for anyone concerned about the imposition of critical social justice, aka woke, and or COVID mandates in their workplace, university, children's school, or community. We offer weekly online peer support groups in which members share ideas, thoughts, and support for how to navigate the impact of these ideologies and answer the question, where do we go from here? You can join one of our groups for only $5 a month. To find out how to join our community, please visit solidgroundsupport.com. And please note that Solid Ground does not provide psychotherapy or legal advice, and nothing we do should be construed as such.
Thanks, Deborah. And yeah, so it's an interesting thing to talk about. I know that there's a lot more flexibility in female sexuality than male sexuality, and a lot of homosexual women have previously been with male partners or then go on to maybe have male partners, and the same with heterosexual women. There's lots of heterosexual women have had female partners in the past or have played around with homosexuality and have that flexibility in their concept of themselves and what they're interested in a partner. But is there anything hardwired? What are y'all's thoughts on this? And Aaron, do you want to maybe go into your statements that you've made around this?
Sure. Yeah. So that is something that I've been kind of looking into just the last few months. It's kind of caught my attention. Just how, like you were saying, this is so common amongst women who will, identify as lesbian for, so many years, and then suddenly they're in relationships with men, or in the other direction. It's really common in the other direction, where, or actually, no, excuse me, the opposite is true. When you're in, college age, the whole lesbian until graduation thing, that's a very common trope among women. But then, yeah, the reverse will also happen of somebody who's dated men all their life, been married to men, et cetera. And then suddenly, Kathleen Stock is a really good example of this. And then suddenly in later in life, realize that they're actually attracted to women. And this is something that I never really thought that much about. Like you were saying, Leslie, it's like female sexuality just doesn't seem to be as concrete as male, or it's more, I guess I wouldn't have put it in those terms then. I would have said, yeah, it's more fluid, or females are more likely, or women are more likely to be bisexual. But I think it's something else entirely. That I think where we've gone wrong is just assuming that heterosexual, homosexual dichotomy as relates to males. I don't think it actually applies to females that way. I think that really category and target driven experience of sexuality is a male experience of sexuality, whereas female sexuality is much more driven by bonds of intimacy and dynamic and sense of identity and things of just, it's just so much more complex, and it's not as hard line as heterosexual or homosexual. So I think Jordan Peterson is correct in that when it comes to the word, it's like, what do we typically, when somebody says lesbian, they mean exclusively same-sex attracted female. And I think that if those women exist, I mean, it's likely that, that certainly everything exists basically within the world. I'm sure there are some women who are exclusively all their lives only attracted to other women. I'm sure those women exist, but I believe that they are incredibly, incredibly rare. I think the vast majority of people who identify themselves as lesbian are just prefer relationships with women for a myriad of reasons.
And how much of this is social? How much of this is because there's been a greater social prohibition against homosexuality among men in recent cultural history, and for women it's been a little bit more acceptable to have same-sex relationships. How much of are we going to see a shift in male sexual flexibility as those cultural prohibitions are lifted or softened?
Well, this is something else I've been thinking about. Is I think the reason for that, the reason that male homosexuality has been so often criminalized, whereas or just socially taboo, whereas that hasn't ever really been the case for female homosexuality or homosexual acts, let's say. I think it is because for males, there's their sexuality is highly linked to a disgust response. So like engaging in sex acts that don't appeal to them elicit a disgust response, which I think is kind of explains a lot of homophobia. It's usually male have a kind of like, a gut aversion to the idea of sex between two men. And but they don't have that same, and typically men are the ones who are, often in most cases, certainly historically, the legislatures, et cetera. Anyway, so I think this kind of male sexual response has, just in the same way that we assume the whole heterosexual homosexual dichotomy applies to females. But I think one of the reasons that like female same-sex behavior isn't so taboo or criminalized in varieties of like cultures and throughout time is because there isn't that gut, because I don't think most women have that kind of disgust response to lesbianism that many straight men have towards homosexuality. I think that has something to do with that response.
Well, and actually, go ahead.
I wonder if it has to do with the promiscuity that is part of male gay culture, if that has sort of shocked people, and that's part of how it came to be stigmatized. I'm just thinking about bathhouse culture and all of that, where you go and you might have sex with 10 different people in one day, all of whom are strangers, and there's no pretense whatsoever that this is, going to lead to a relationship or to any kind of attachment. I don't know if there's something analogous to that in lesbian culture. I don't think that there is, and I wonder if that promiscuity is also part of what caused this. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that when we look at lesbian, like if we want to take a look at male sexuality versus female sexuality, the great way to shine a light on that is to look at gay male culture versus lesbian culture. Because you talk about that bathhouse scenario where it's like all, a bunch of guys just want to have, no strings attached, promiscuous sex. That's not specific to gay men. It's just gay men are able to do it because the partners that they're seeking have that same propensity.
Right. They're not negotiating
if a
with
straight
women.
man could, yeah. If a straight man could go into a bathhouse and it's full of a bunch of women who want to have sex with him, and pretty much they're all going to do that. But I think, whereas when you look at lesbian culture, you see the opposite. It's like 2 dates and we're moving in together. It's very monogamous, very attachment oriented. Yeah.
Well, and I wonder also if one of the reasons why it's been less stigmatized for women to engage in homosexual behavior is because it's a safe form of female promiscuity. If a woman is going to have dalliances with another woman, if chastity is important culturally and socially over or traditional cultures anyway, because of paternity concerns. You have men fetishize lesbians, partly, I think, because it's a safe way for them to see a woman with another woman without getting their own, without a threat to themselves.
I think you're 100% correct. That had not occurred to me. I think you're right. Yeah.
Matt Von Wald in the chat says, men and women cannot understand each other. It's all an approximation. I think that's an interesting comment. And I think that there are elements of anybody's life that another person can't ever fully understand. We try to understand one another through dialogue and through getting to know each other and attempting to take perspective from the other person. But I do think that there's perhaps something to that. And I don't know. What do you think? Jennifer, you look like you have a thought about that.
I think that the differences between men and women and how we think is just incredibly fascinating, and is the source of both a lot of misery and comedy. And so I enjoy it, and at the same time, it makes me nuts. I think we really are quite different in how we experience things. And I think if you have a long-term intimate relationship with a partner and you're really trying hard to understand that person's experience, you do come to understand how the opposite sex thinks a little bit more, but it's always going to seem foreign to you. Like, well, okay, I know you probably think that. I still think that's bizarre, but okay.
Well, and Mega Dirk 3, that's a funny name too, in the chat says, I'll do one better. I do not even understand myself. So, Erin, do you have any insight, and just throughout your life experience, do you have a sense, perhaps of what male, female? Is there a way for us to understand each other? Or do you think that there's something to that comment, or?
Yeah, because I mean, everybody's going to apply their own lens to to what they're observing naturally, but excuse me. But I do think, yeah, there is a considerable difference between males and females psychologically, but especially in the realm of sexuality. I think I kind of got a cheat hack, you might say, by being a female who's on male levels of testosterone. And when that first hit like 10 years ago, it completely turned my experience of sexuality all the way around. And so I can't say that I know that I've firsthand experience of male sexuality, because again, I am female. We don't know what testosterone does to the to our psychology that way. But I do know that that within just a few weeks, my sexuality became incredibly visual, based in visuals, and very kind of target specific. It was very it wasn't something that I'd experienced before. My sexuality before was very much tied to kind of infatuations. It's like if I develop romantic feelings for someone, there's so much about this person that appeals to me, and then that becomes sexual attraction. Whereas that's not how it works anymore. It's very much like it's very based in visuals and has absolutely nothing to do with anything about that person's personality or anything else. It's very much about the body, and the rest of it is kind of an afterthought, whereas before it would have been the opposite.
I'm
what a
wondering,
fascinating experience. Go ahead, Deborah.
Sorry, I'm just wondering, because this target versus this more diffuse thing is interesting. And then I'm also wondering with the autogynephilia, and maybe other people have been talking about this, since it's still a target thing, it just becomes the self. And because people have speculated, is there the female version of that? But do you think because women wouldn't necessarily sort of do this more targeted thing, would it be likely that they would? I don't know if I'm making sense with this question. I don't know if the phenomenon of autogynephilia has this targeting thing embedded in it, and would women do the same thing towards themselves if they don't do this sort of targeting process? Does that question make sense?
It makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Okay.
And Yep. And I'm
To
doing
anybody
this.
else, does it make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, is everybody following along here? Because I think this is really important, because this is something I've also been spending a lot of time speculating on, because I do think that does exist, and I do think I have it. Is this inability? So what I believe AGP is an inability to differentiate between the self and what one is externally attracted to. It's mixing those two up. It's like not being able to realize that, you know, you should not embody what it is that you are attracted to. And I think it exists to different degrees. Like there are some autogynephiles who their heterosexuality has completely backfired. There's no attraction to actual women. The attraction is entirely to being the woman. And then there are some for whom it could be like, you know, a fun kink occasionally, you know, but they're primarily attracted to actual women. But yes, I do think that the same experience exists in females, but it's not going to be fetishistic, because our sexuality isn't fetishistic, because again, it's not object oriented, and it's going to be heavily dynamic driven, right? It's going to be, but it's still the same thing. It's still mixing up who it is you're attracted to and what the self should be. And therefore, my most controversial opinion, and something I've been writing about a lot lately, is I think the majority of butch lesbians are actually autoandrophilic. They are embodying the masculinity that they are attracted to, and they are in relationships with more feminine women, because that helps to enhance the self as masculine. So it's not going to be about the clothes, and it's not going to be about, and it's not even going to be all that necessarily on the surface sexual. It's not going to be even identifiable as sexual, I think, to most, but it is linked to the core heterosexuality being backfired, is what I believe. Because what you've seen historically is when butch lesbians started transitioning, I would say a majority, we don't actually have the stats on this, but just anecdotally watching how this played out in the past, is many, if not most, did go on to identify as gay men. They started dating men. And I think that is because when they embodied that masculinity via transition, that butch lesbian identity and having the feminine partner, those no longer serve the purpose that they had. And now that actual root-based attraction to men is tangible. Also, when you turn, you know, because testosterone is going to increase a female sex drive exponentially. And so I think that's when that kind of root, because like we were saying in the beginning, is like women can kind of harness their sexuality to in the service of their identity. And I think that's what a lot of butch lesbians were doing, was harnessing their sexuality into a homosexual orientation in order to manifest the masculine in themselves. Does that make sense?
So it's identity driven over like attraction per se. Wow, that's a statement.
That's really interesting.
It sounds like it's sort of like an attraction to how you want to perceive or experience yourself. And so you're attracted to that which gives you that experience.
Well, that
100%.
actually ties in a little bit with one of the comments that I just saw, some thoughts I was having about a comment in the chat. It is 80s Nostalgia Guy says, women would not leave the house without makeup on their face if they were not thinking about sex. And I thought, as somebody who's worn a full face of makeup since I was 14 years old, almost every day of my life, I think it's more about identity than sex by far. I'm not thinking about sex in the morning when I slog through putting on my mascara.
Yes, you
thinking
are.
About it.
Yes,
yeah,
you are. You ho. You're like, I'm gonna get some. I'm getting some. You know you are.
My husband likes me without makeup, so he prefers me without makeup. If it was about that, I'd probably I'd keep it off. But it's about it's about seeing yourself the way you want to see yourself. And so I wonder if that's part of what you're describing here when you're talking about a different aesthetic, but it's a different, but it seems like it's a similar question. Like, what is this about for this person?
Mhm.
Yep. Yep. And I think again, for women, it's going to be much more, it's much more subtle and much more complicated than just being directly sexual.
And then they're choosing, they're finding themselves attracted to men. So interesting. Like imagine the surprise, right? Like you're like, wait a minute.
Yep. And a lot of them are actually kind of find themselves disturbed by that change in sexuality. And that kind of goes to show how it wasn't like something that they were actively repressing, actively ignoring. It literally, their identity of being a lesbian had completely surmounted any sort of underlying attraction to men.
Is that the hormones just separate from the identity piece? Like, could the hormones just make you have a different drive aside from what you're thinking of yourself? Or
well, because if you take male levels of testosterone, you're going to have a more male typical sexuality, right? Because testosterone is like the sex hormone. I mean, that's what starts flooding boys' brains, or bodies in general, around puberty, and that's why they go insane. It's like it's a very girls don't have that experience. There's no flooding of testosterone that makes you just like sex obsessed, or women have always there isn't this like great turning point in sexuality in a female's life. What I believe happens is, and I keep saying females, I know that kind of sounds offensive to some people, but I'm doing it because that to also include females such as myself and and all the those of us who have transitioned, because these are the ones who I've been like drawing the most from, is what happens when you give a female male levels of testosterone. I think so like you were saying before, the identity was what mattered. That identity as a butch lesbian, as a masculine woman, that is what mattered. And the being a member of the lesbian community and having the female partner, the feminine partner, and it was all this total sense of self, a sense of who you are, what your identity is, where you fit inside this community, and your romantic behavior is kind of in association with that identity, community, culture, etc. When you have male levels of testosterone in your body, you can no longer prioritize identity over, and again, I'm not talking consciously, but you're no longer prioritizing identity, community, culture. All those factors are they're completely out of the picture. What matters is, it's not even what matters, because again, it sounds like I'm talking about this consciously, but it is just like a biological, like it's like
you're swept.
Physiological.
You're like swept into this other thing.
Right. Yeah.
I think one of the areas where we see this conversation around lesbians right now, at least online, the conversation is around trans-identified males entering like dating forums and online dating apps and things, presenting themselves as lesbians, and this argument kind of going back and forth, like that genitals have nothing to do with sexual preference in terms of lesbian, that you would be attracted to the identity. And a lot of people are really upset about this, and I can understand why, because there seems to be an element of a profound deception going on. But how does that factor into your thoughts around this, Aaron?
So that's a really good question. The problem, not the problem, but a lot of the in the kind of gender critical sphere, and everybody who's in this kind of in response to that just the overreach and that kind of that sexual entitlement of all these trans women who are saying genitals don't matter, and I'm a lesbian and lesbians should accept me as such. And so I think a lot of the reason why I get the kind of angry pushback I do is because of the context that this conversation is having within, which is is an attempt to maintain and shore up those boundaries. And I completely sympathize with that. And I 100% think that, that these males co-opting lesbianism should not be on the apps. They should not, that just like, I'm with I'm with them on the whole, leave lesbians alone thing in this context. But, this was what my, years ago, this is where I was too, like trying to draw attention to what autogynephilia is so people can see the difference. They can see why these men are there. They can see what's going on, and so that these boundaries can be protected. And I still definitely want those boundaries to be protected. But the more I look into it, and the more, as with anything, like the more you research something, the more you dive into something, the more nuance is revealed there. And so a lot of the people combating that, the trans women encroaching on boundaries are doing so like lesbians are same-sex attracted females, exclusively same-sex attracted females. And I just don't, those boundaries absolutely should be respected, and women should not feel coerced into, like, certainly not sexually endorsing anyway, I'm having a hard time articulating this, but
well, it sounds like you're saying that lesbianism is a social category, but that it is a real social category, and that people have the right to define their boundaries for themselves. And if that's what you mean when you say lesbian, then that should be respected. And yet you're also saying that you don't believe that it's as hardwired as homosexuality in men. So it's not a biological category, but it's a real social category. Okay. Interesting.
Yes.
Yeah. Someone in here also made another comment that I thought was pretty cool, or interesting. It was, Son of Philip says, men have this literal physical yearning like hunger. It is incredibly physicalized in our bodies in a way that I just don't think women understand. That is something, and someone else made a comment that women have yearnings too, but they have them cyclically, and it's more, maybe during the month it'll ebb and flow. And I as a woman, I can relate to that sense of yearning, but I also know that I've heard men talk about this in a way that's like, no, you don't understand just how powerful this is. It takes us over, especially during adolescence. It's just such a powerful drive and so I think that is, I know, it's hard for women to talk about male sexuality and men to be in the audience and hear that. We get a lot of pushback when we do that. So I don't want to make assumptions about someone else. I just want to call attention to that comment in the chat.
Yeah, I was on Heterodorks recently with, I know you guys recently had Nita Paley on, but I was on Heterodorks recently, and how I was explaining it was that male sexuality is compulsive, and I don't think female sexuality is. I think that's a distinction that's kind of useful. There's that physical force that is male sexuality, that is how males experience sexuality. I just don't think that that women do or can even understand it or relate with it. And I think a lot of feminists, a lot of their anger, it's like, I'm advocating for empathy across the board, but yeah, obviously everybody is 100% responsible for their own actions. But I think we need to be aware that the female experience of sexuality is very different than the male experience of it, and they should. Be given some empathy for how overwhelming that is.
The same commenter, Son of Philip, comments again. It is incredibly difficult to control, and there is a lot of frustration between men and women because we wish women would understand and help us. Yes, this means we need.
Sorry,
but he goes on to say,
us.
This might surprise you, Jennifer. He says, yes, this means we need your modesty, and so that's interesting. We need your modesty, and
that's interesting.
Okay,
yeah, that's an interesting.
I must be the devil, because as soon as someone says that, I instantly want to be like, I'm making you want to do it. You can't control it. I don't know. I feel like I might be a little bit, I feel like I might have been a little bit of a sexual outlier as a female when I was younger, because that force thing you're talking about and it being a physical force, I had that, and I felt like I was like something like that had just been wound up and turned loose. And I had like this feeling of like such intense sexual desire. I felt like punching holes in walls. And I mean, it's kind of awful, really. But the thing was, I still very much had the female side of it's not satisfying to me to have sex with a bunch of different partners. Like I have to be in a long-term stable relationship. So if I'm not, I'm half out of my mind. But I think it led me to partner with people that really weren't the right partners for me so that I could be in a secure, stable sexual relationship.
So
If
it
that
kind of
makes
clouded
sense.
your relationship motivation in that way.
I think it did in some ways, because if I look at things objectively, like I certainly wasted some time, you know? And I think it was so that I could be in a secure, stable, committed relationship because I wanted to have a sexual relationship. So I had sort of like, I don't know, like a weird combination of the two. But I definitely had that force, not to the point where I ever would have wanted to like go to a bathhouse and have sex with random strangers. But yeah, it really, woof, it was powerful.
The wonderful world of awesomeness says, so this is a room full of biological women talking about men's sexuality. No, actually, the we're talking about lesbians, but it kind of it does kind of it runs into interesting areas. There's lots of, I guess, there's lots of fruit on this tree, and there, you know, I think talking about sexuality at all kind of opens up a field of exploration around sexuality. And what does it mean? What does it mean to be a lesbian? What does that mean? I think in defining that, you're kind of talking about what it means to not be a lesbian, what it means to be a woman versus a man, and what it means to have sexual compulsions or interests and orientation. So no, I want to include the comments. I always like to include the live stream comments, and some men have made some really good points that I've then read out, and we've had discussions about them. But no, we're not trying. In fact, we've kind of talked right about that. There's humility in the discussion of male sexuality here, I think. But it is mostly about lesbians. Sorry, Deborah, you were going to say something before I interrupted with that.
It wasn't going to be just about male sexuality, but I am been long wondering or wishing that there was some kind of, you know, whether it's, you know, qigong or even like energetic tantric practices. Like I think it would be great if young people were learning to work with like these huge energies in their body when they're younger. I mean, again, whether it's like Montauk Chi, I'm thinking of the different people who actually help people like harness sexually. So it's like okay to have the energy, actually help you feel, breathe it, it's, you know, energize it. So you don't necessarily feel as compelled to act, but you're not suppressing it and you're not having shame about it. And it's actually quite energizing and potentially like creative for other uses if you don't happen to have a partner there, or you're not suddenly coupling with somebody that you really wish you hadn't for a variety of reasons. So I would love to see, of course, I don't want to be like some woke person trying to enforce, and now, okay, we're going to be in 5th grade and we're going to teach you how to do a microcosmic orbit of your, I don't want to get that into school, but I just wish that was available to like teenagers or something somewhere, or people knew about that, or they could play with that, because I don't want to shove anything back into a box or make it unnatural, but it seems like, how does this get harnessed in a really positive way for, say, the men that's happening, or if it's a woman who has just a strong sexual drive, where they are more at choice around what they're going to do in relationship to other people, instead of feeling like, you know,
I think you're talking to something that's really important, and that's the need through maturation to come to terms with these drives. And as a process of maturation, to be able to master our drives so that they're not mastering us. And that seems to be around sex. It certainly seems like it's the opposite thing that's being encouraged right now culturally. Like, let's have let's have pornography be the most popular thing on the internet. And let's have people talk about sex and sexuality and anal sex and all this stuff to school kids. Let's do that right in your school before you even have a sense of whether you're what you want sexually at all. You're coming up with a sexual identity. I think I heard you say something about that, or saw you talk to that, didn't I, Erin?
Yeah. It's girls especially, because obviously we sexually mature much later than boys do. But because of this culture that you're describing, especially online, where girls, everybody has to have these identity labels, like, you know, pansexual, queer, like
Demi. Yeah.
right. And that's another. I think that the whole demisexual thing is. I think the vast majority of women are demisexual. It just means
Thank
you don't
you.
have sexual attraction without an emotional connection to someone. It's like I
Yep.
think that's just female sexuality. But yeah, they have all these labels, and the thing is you can't be cis and straight. Like you can't be not some flavor of LGBTQ, right? And so there's this massive incentive to that's how you demonstrate that you are a good progressive. So these in the minds of like Gen Z girls, that is. So these girls, because they're so online and they know that having value as a human being is directly related to having some sort of marginalized identity point, many of them come out as lesbians, or bisexual, pansexual, whatever it may be, well before their sexuality ever has a chance to develop. I mean, they're having these identities at like 11, 12, 13, and then a lot of them, another terrible factor of all this is, the Gen Z girls' mental health crisis. So many of them are on SSRIs, which are diminish your sex drive anyway in normal adults who are already developed. But I mean, being on these through adolescence, I mean, a lot of them, this is why I think the whole epidemic of the whole asexuality thing. I think they're really feeling like they are asexual, and I think it's often the pharmaceutically induced. But yeah, they're not actually like maturing in a normal fashion. And when a lot of times when their actual sexuality does kick in, sometimes maybe not until early 20s, it's in conflict with their actual what they've been saying online, because so many of them, their entire identities are avatars online, right? And so and it's completely divorced from their real life experiences. And so when they are actually having real life experiences, and because it's kind of how we're biologically designed, most likely those desires are going to be for men, but that's completely counter to the identity that they have become attached to, could be over the last even decade. Because again, it's just kind of ridiculous that they have to have these identities before, well before it naturally exists in them.
Mm-hmm. And then there'd be some kind of a concretizing of that through social connection.
Yeah.
Which it's hard for people to say. It's hard for anybody to say that they're wrong. It's hard to go back on something, especially when there's so much pressure to be authentic and not be a poser, to come back and say, no, I actually am this thing over here. That's why there's this phrase coming out. Coming out is hard, no matter which way you're coming out.
Well, it's not just saying I was wrong. It also saying I actually belong to the oppressor class.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You're opting into being a bad guy, essentially.
Yeah.
Two things here. So Matt Von Wald says, I like women who have purple walls. Wonder who that could be about. And there's a D-Lav. I just want to read this out because there's D-Lav has been sharing in the chat a story about I think it's his, maybe her mom being a lesbian and their process. And but then D-Lav, I'm just gonna say his because I think it was a he, says, I'm gonna say this straight out. My mom is an amazing woman. A lesbian she may be, but she's the most consistently principled, ethical, and conscientious human being I know. I love you, Mom. And I just thought that was really lovely. Just an expression of appreciation for someone's mother. So that was a side note. Let's see.
That's lovely.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So interesting. How many of you have had bisexual impulses? Like, how many of you are attracted to both women and men in this group? I'll say for myself, I have always been primarily attracted to men, but like you said, Aaron, I've never been repulsed by the idea of a woman. I kissed a couple of girls in high school, and my best friend and I She's been my best friend for over 25 years. When we were younger and we were both divorced at one point in our lives together, we had a joke that if we were still single late in life, we would move to New Hampshire and become lesbians. And it's always been a joke. We've never had any attraction for each other at all, but it always was like this comforting fallback plan that was mostly a joke, but also like, yeah, we'll have some cats and some plants, maybe raise chickens. It'd be nice. So it's never been a repugnant idea to me to think of myself ending up with a female life partner. That just never bothered me. I've just been more attracted to men. So that's my primary driver. But what do any of you have a flexibility in your sexuality that same way?
I'm on the extremely far end of the heterosexual scale. And but the thing is, I find women to be extremely beautiful. So aesthetically, I think women are so beautiful. I can stare at women much more than I would stare at most men. So in a way, I think, well, that would be nice if I was also sexually attracted to this group of people to whom I'm aesthetically attracted. But lo and behold, I am absolutely not sexually. I'm attracted to giant, smelly gorillas. So, well, I don't know what you can do.
I don't know if I'd go with the gorillas. I'm probably more attracted to men. I can appreciate a beautiful woman. I'd probably say of the men that I've been drawn to, they probably have more of that. It's like this sort of Ren Fair kind of, like some princely, whatever. Like they might have some feminine, like in them. I mean, there's been some hulky guys I've liked, but I probably have generally been drawn to ones that are a little more, that sort of like refined, or they
You
tend
like
to have
elegant men.
some emotional. I mean, I've been with some that have been like very hairy and smelly, and that just really grossed me out. So now that said, like I saw a guy at the gym the other day lifting, and he just like, I don't know, I just like the shoulders and the weight. I was like, oh, so I mean, I don't know about like Joe Rogan, probably too bulked, neck a little too thick. So this was fine. Like they might, yeah, like I don't know, yeah. So there's a little bit more like length. I don't know, something for me.
Hey, Jordan Peterson is very lengthy and elegant. Perhaps
he is your type. He is. Well, they don't necessarily be elegant. Like I'm thinking I've had a lot of hippie boys too, and so maybe like long hair. They're still masculine, but maybe they back in the 90s they had the longer hair. I don't know. So.
I'm the outlier in my theory, not of your guys' story, but of my theory about the lesbian to gay trans man, because I went in the opposite direction. I was only attracted to men prior to transitioning. Certainly more feminine men for sure. Definitely not the hairy gorillas, not my thing at all. But for me, the attraction to men was very much it was like a romantic. It was like. I don't know. It was like the men are who I developed feelings for. They were who I, but it wasn't so much about their bodies. I was kind of like, I could give or take their bodies. Like, it was just like, that was what their body was. It was like, whatever. I didn't really care. It wasn't a very physical attraction. It was very much a kind of an emotional kind of, yeah, I don't know really how to describe it all that well, but it was very much that my sexual desire followed my romantic interest. But then when I started transitioning, the target completely shifted. I became incredibly physically attracted to females, which had never been the case before. I had zero attraction to women, and I actually did have that kind of disgust. So when I would think, because so I always wished I was a lesbian because that would make sense for my masculinity. But I was repulsed by the idea of sex with a woman. But yeah, anyway, then that all changed with testosterone. And I was actually prescribed half a dose when I first started, started on half the normal dose. And it was weird. My attractions to men stayed, but I was much more physically attracted to women. It was much more that kind of powerful force we discussed. That was towards women, but my attraction to men remained. But it was again much more romantic, and I wasn't all that concerned about their bodies. But then was it 2017 is when my endocrinologist increased my dose to the normal, the typical, and so essentially doubled it. At which point, all attraction to men completely went away, and I'm strictly attracted to women now. And in fact, the opposite when I think about like engaging sexually with males, it's the kind of same disgust response I had to the opposite before. So it's directly hormonal, I guess, for me. It's
Wow.
interesting.
That's
How did that-
fascinating.
In terms of identity with that, like, and not even a hard identity, but like knowing yourself, like that's just a shift, like whatever it was. Say you liked, I don't even know, some completely other thing than sexually, right? And then like suddenly think about people with political parties. I thought I was a liberal, but now I'm a conservative. I mean, I don't know. It's not the same thing, obviously, but I just wonder, like, being this person now that's like, wow, I thought I knew myself, and clearly there's an intervention. So there's something else going on. I didn't just switch on a dime with no inputs. But like, what was that like to have that change?
You know, I didn't really think of it so much in terms of my identity all that much. I was very I had a previous experience that was much more kind of psychologically kind of throwing me kind of turning everything upside down for me. It was that I grew up evangelical Christian, like hardcore I was until my early 20s, and I re-examined everything. I was like, okay, this turns out to not be true. That was a huge blow to my identity and kind of like sense of the world. So because I was very much and I still am terrified of mortality, but in Christianity and a lot of religions have this great thing that offers you immortality. And so letting go of that was very, very difficult. But so since then, I've kind of taken other things, you know, a lot easier as they come, like things that kind of disrupt my sense of identity or sense of the world is kind of easier to take in my stride. I would say. But yeah, I didn't really have much of a, because I had always had this internal sense that I was supposed to be male. And in fact, so when obviously I was attracted to boys and then later men, like that was kind of a it's not really an identity blow, but it was like, so you'd think that once that changed and I was attracted to women, it's like, oh, this validates my masculinity or whatever. That wasn't the case either. It was just kind of like, I don't know. I guess I didn't really have much of a sense of identity invested in my sexuality, much more so that sense of self as being male. And then since I was physically manifesting that, it was just like all of those, it relieved the gender dysphoria. And I think that's more where my focus was. There's a sense of relief, and kind of like what happened to my sexuality was sort of, didn't have much of my attention, I guess.
It's so interesting. I wonder what the role of an individual woman's hormones might be in her interest in other women. So if there might be like, you know, as you described, this increase in testosterone making you attracted to women in a way that you hadn't been before. If women who naturally have a higher level of testosterone in their system, or I don't know, a different hormone balance, might find themselves really drawn to other women sexually, and so then and also I wonder about the role of aversion to men in choosing to be with women instead, because I think there's a lot of women who feel either that they've had terrible relationships with men, or that they're afraid of men, or have in fact I spoke with a young woman not that long ago who was really distressed by her attraction to men, wanting to be a lesbian, but finding herself kind of disgusted by her own sexual attraction to males, because she didn't like anything about that role, the role of a woman with a man. She would have liked to have been a man herself, or to have at least been interested in other women. And so there was, it was her interest in lesbianism or being a woman or being with a woman was almost entirely motivated by social fear or aversion to males or relationships with males.
I think that's something else that we're not really supposed to talk about in this conversation of lesbianism. Is I think a lot of women who are drawn and do identify as a lesbian and live as such, a lot of it is more of a push than a pull. It's fleeing men or wanting to be off limits to men, and I think, and that could be due to like direct negative experiences with men, but I think more so now, and this may have been the case with the young woman you were talking about, with porn, the access, everybody has access to this very just hardcore porn that's very degrading to women. It's very often violent, and I think a lot of teenage girls are seeing this stuff and thinking that's what a heterosexual relationship is, and none of them are going to want that, and so I think that has, if that's your sex education, is this kind of hardcore porn, yeah, you can understand why a lot of young women would not want anything to do with that.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And I think also this other point that Ninja Kitty is bringing up about feminist influence, Ninja Kitty says, sounds like a lot of feminist influence has made an issue she already had worse. And I don't know if he's speaking to what I said or if somebody else in the chat, but my daughter, who is now, she's almost 26, when she was in college at university, she studied feminist philosophy. She took a feminist philosophy class, and it really did a number on her. She said she went through a big depression for a while after that class because she couldn't stop thinking of things in terms of female oppression. And I mean, the way she was told to both feel like she was empowered, but also resent men, and also feel like she was disempowered because she was such a victim. And this way of looking at things really skewed things for her. So if all you're telling people is that there's that everything is made out of power and that you're the oppressed, I think that does a number on relationships between the sexes as well.
100%, yeah.
I think there's also something about being female that is frightening because of the vulnerability, and that becomes more pronounced in our romantic relationships because women do obviously the major contributing to creating a child, and there's a real vulnerability in being pregnant. There's a vulnerability in having a child that just isn't carried by men in the same way, and this is something women have to grapple with. And I think that I think sort of like the pathway to peace in that is to see the beauty in it, and also to find a relationship with a person who really honors that and who protects you when you're vulnerable and whom you can count on. But I think that it's frightening to a lot of women. It certainly was to me when I was young, and I think that it takes strength to be that vulnerable, and you can really only be that vulnerable in a healthy way if you are with a strong, consistent, reliable male, because otherwise you're doing something kind of self-destructive, right? Like if you're going to go out and get pregnant by a bunch of different unreliable, sketchy guys who aren't going to commit to you, aren't going to marry you, and are never going to bother paying child support. I mean, you can really ruin yourself and possibly ruin your kids. And so I think there is a ton of vulnerability involved with being female. And I don't mean that in the sense of we're victims. This is just biological. This is sort of what we've got. These are like the cards that we've got to play with. And I think it's complicated for us. And I know that the men have their own set of things that are complicated and frightening to them, but I'm not speaking to that right now. I'm just speaking to the female side. And I can see why some young women think, holy shit, I'm scared of that, especially if they're not coming into contact with males that they think really would support them and that they really can count on.
It just made me think of, it's so sad. I mean, not that there isn't room for reform and cleanup at that end, but you think of some of whether it's the military, you think of the police, like any of these characters that would have been the protectors. And then like this day and age in our society, they're sort of disdained. It's like, oh my God, they're all killing people, black men, whatever, right? Like, it's like, I'm just trying to think where people are even getting role models. You're seeing a lot of the strong young woman, like she's the superhero and she's kicking the ass of all the guys. But I don't know if men aren't even allowed so much in media these days to be strong and be the protectors in some sense. And so I'm just thinking, like, I don't know if women or men are getting to even see these archetypal images, have access to them. I don't know.
It's very culturally discouraged currently.
Yeah, that's it. That's a perfect way of putting it. Yes. Thank you for that. Yeah. Yeah. It's like people are being taught that responsibility is a negative thing.
Sorry, I keep interrupting you, Jennifer.
No,
it's because you called me a hoe earlier, so now I'm just going to interrupt you all the time. D Lav says, Leslie, whenever I become critical of feminism with my lesbian feminist mother, she calmly reminds me of the sheer amount of male on female violence happening casually every day across the world. And I wanted to throw that out there because I think that's, I mean, feminism, I don't know. I've said this before. I don't know what I really think about feminism. I've never considered myself a feminist, but I've also never considered all of feminism to be bad either. I think that there's been some important strides, but also some excesses in the whole feminist movement. And I am not a feminist scholar, so I'm not the best person to speak to this. But there is some real reason to talk about the differences and the negatives between the sexes and how to protect people and how to educate people around that. But also, I don't think the answer is to make every woman afraid of every man or to try to diminish men in order to make them all pay for how some of them do violent things.
Yeah. Yeah. I was just thinking about it is like that equity thing. It's like we're just going to lower the floor for everybody. It's like because of the bad apple. I'm thinking about the other side of it too. I mean, yeah, I clearly do not want men being physically violent against women. And I'm thinking about the men who it's different. It's the harm like emotionally that they might take or psychically abuse, like to have a partner who's carping or whatever, putting you down all the time. And it is different than like being killed or have your arm broken, but it's not nothing. I think there's those ways we often think women, oh, they aren't doing any damage, and they can, but it's subtler.
Well, do lesbians exist?
And do you think, by the way, he meant, I don't remember where that was, the context it was in, but I don't know if he meant it just because they do seem to be getting erased. Was he saying it from that, or was he saying he doesn't believe there really are any?
I think he meant it literally. And I think, and also,
okay.
I was recently watching, if everyone's familiar with Eric Weinstein, kind of in the similar, so he was recently on Modern Wisdom, another podcast, and he said that with the trans thing, because Chris was like, "What, what's going on with the trans stuff?" And Eric said, with the trans phenomenon and why everybody's so gung ho for it, he said, "We're trying to not get male homosexuality wrong again." And he was very clear about because he doesn't believe that female homosexuality is a thing in the same way that male homosexuality is. This was a few months ago that I watched that podcast, and I agreed with him. And just like I agree with not Jordan Peterson, it wasn't good semantically how he phrased that. But I mean, the ultimate point I think is I think it's not that lesbianism doesn't exist, but it is not the same thing as male homosexuality. I think that'd be a good good explanation.
Yeah.
Well, that's a good. I think that's a good place to cap that off. That works really well. Erin, do you want to tell people where they can find you online?
Yeah, so I am Aaron Terrell on Substack. It's also called Trans Trending. So you can find me there on Substack. Also the Transparency podcast, and highly active on Twitter. That's where I'm putting most of my contrarian stuff before I kind of expand the idea further on the Substacker podcast. But yeah, that's where I can be found. Well,
I have really enjoyed speaking with you, and thanks for coming in to have this chat with us. And maybe someday we'll get an actual lesbian to to join the conversation about
We can find one.
whether everybody, it's eclipse time. You guys ready?
Oh, that's right.
We'll go.
Yeah. Jennifer's too cool for the eclipse.
Way too cool.
I don't know what Aaron's problem is, but Jennifer